excited to tell you about my Paulk workbench, and in particular I'm going to focus on some problems that I had as an inexperienced carpenter that I hope the insights that I gained will be useful to others that maybe like me are weekend warriors and not professional cabinet makers and maybe don't have so much experience with pocket screws or a router, and maybe you're a little too intimidated to get started or you get stuck along the way. Hopefully a couple of these tips will be useful. There's some excellent videos out there on how to make a Paulk workbench by people with much more experience than I have, and you should definitely watch those. But in addition, maybe a couple of the insights that I have gained will be useful to you. The first thing I want to tell you about, maybe in no particular order, is table saw integration. I picked up this table saw for literally 20 bucks at a garage sale, and I was thinking about getting rid of it until I made my bench and decided to try to integrate it with the bench and see how it goes. It's a little 10-inch Ryobi. And the thing that I want to tell you about is that when you're designing this, I wouldn't bother to put these plates in until you've gotten the entire thing assembled. Literally wait till the very last step. And the reason for that is that it's very hard to get the alignment right, and especially if you're not using the DeWalt saw that it was designed for. Now, I've never tried it with that, but I think some of the tips here would help with that as well. So what I recommend you do is build whatever supports that you're gonna build before, maybe make a rough design, know about where your holes are gonna be, then build these. There's a lot of little crappy details that you need to get right. Like, for example, there's all this plastic and other stuff that's in the way on the edge of mine. So I had to cut and router out little holes, little slots in the boards. And then put a couple of these plates in with your hole where you think it ought to go vertically. And don't bother with a plate on the second bulkhead. There's no reason for it at all. It doesn't support any weight. All the weight is on the back one and on the front one. There's no load bearing happening whatsoever on this middle bar. I don't think it provides any vibration stability. It has absolutely no function except for to make alignment more difficult. Then get the vertical alignment correct. If your vertical alignment is not correct, then you can measure that at this point, measure how much high or low you are, and cut a new one of these. Get it in place, but don't bother to screw it in, just being very careful, maybe clamp it on, and get your alignment of the front done. Obviously, you'll need to have a back one in place, clamped in place as well, but don't worry about the overall pitch of the thing. Because what I'm gonna tell you next is, this is the fulcrum. So if you get this alignment within, say, get it like maybe a 64th, not a 64th, a 16th or so higher than the bench, then this will be the fulcrum. And then you can come to the back end and play around with the height of the back end, clamping it at various heights until you get the slope of the table saw correct. The problem that I had is I thought it was square, level, and true. This came across to maybe a 1/16 of an inch high. It was fine, a little tiny bit of clearance. But the problem was I had a little bit of an up pitch. So what would happen is you'd get a board about 2 feet out over the table, and it would want to cantilever down onto the table. So that means you need to lower the part in there. So what I did was I simply removed this back plate and experimented with different heights of that until this ran true. And the point is that since this was already at the right height, and it's then lowering and raising the other one pivots this about this point, having very little impact on the relative height here, because this is only a couple of inches. So let's say that's 4 feet back there and you go down 1/2 of an inch. This is only 4 inches. So 4 inches divided by 48 inches means that the relative scale of this motion is, 5 parts and 10%. So you're gonna have very little change in the height here when you have a fairly substantial change in the height back there. And so raising and lowering that back support is what can help you get this true. Now these conduits are flexible. They bend a little bit. So no matter how much you measure this thing, you're gonna need to adjust it to get it true. And I'm sure that's true for everyone. The only thing a middle bar, I suppose, could do is prevent a little bit of the flex, but it still needs to be trimmed. And I've got no significant flexion here in a way that's gonna matter. I mean, I'm not pushing down on my saw when I'm running it. So this little bit of flexion here doesn't matter much. I guess a middle support could help a little bit with that if you really are particular and want to put that in, but it's not critical from a mechanic's point of view. The main thing is to get this front adjusted, then adjust the back to get the thing level. And don't bother with any of this until you get the rest of the bench installed. It's pretty easy to work inside. I just used some 1-inch Craig screws, and those would have been a little bit too proud. They would have popped through a little bit, so I just put a little washer to create a little bit of a spacer, and those drive in really easily, and then they don't pop out the other side. So that's one thing. Only use 2 of those and assemble it after the whole rest of the table is together, and that way it's a lot easier to adjust, because otherwise you'll spend all this time getting it in there and it won't even matter because you have to redo it all. So that's one thing. Another thing that I want to tell you is pocket screws do better mechanically if they're done from the outside. And the reason for that is, think about the angle of that screw. That screw is going in at this angle from this board into this board. So it's hitting much more into the meat of this board. Now I knew that before I started this table project, but I decided to implement it the way I had seen online, where the pocket screws are all hidden and they're on the inside. And I did that for most of the table. As you can see, all these pocket screws that were in here are done from the inside. And it looks better, I'm not gonna argue with that. But there were a couple places where the screws then end up popping out, and it's also not creating as strong of a mechanical joint. So if I had it to do again, I would do what I knew about pocket screws, is I would just put the pocket screws in from the outside, and I'd use some wood filler if I was really particular about how it looked. It's a workbench, it doesn't matter. What matters more is its mechanical functionality, so the pocket screws ought to be done from the outside. It's a heck of a lot easier, and if you have any boards that aren't perfect, which I'm not a good carpenter yet, then if this board is slightly proud of this board, then your pocket screw is not going to work from the inside, and it's going to poke out of the top of your bench. But if you do it from the outside in, it'll create a better joint and be a little more forgiving to a new mechanic. Another thing, I've got pretty good spatial reasoning, but when I put in my router table, of course the table was upside down and backwards, and so I put it on the wrong side. I'm also not an experienced router, so I didn't even think that would matter until I began to learn, as I got more experience with my router doing this project, that routers feed right to left. So you have no outfeed table if you put your router here. The material runs off the end of the board. So you've got to do it on the other side. Well, why do I have a blank over here? Well, I wasn't using the router plate recommended by Ron Paulk. I was using my own crappy little hand-me-down, and that's a much bigger router plate. And as a result, I hadn't thought about the fact that my router would then interfere with the table legs. So if you're not going to use the Ron Paulk router, it can be very hard to put it in this last bay. You have to really think about that carefully in advance if you're using a larger router plate. I happen to have a hand-me-down old Craftsman router that is not a great handheld router, but works perfectly fine as a bench router. So I decided to simply integrate that into my bench, which I did here. And so the miter gauge runs along. I didn't bother to put in the back stops to the miter gauge because I still got plenty of material here. I assumed that if the miter gauge was gonna be a little bit deeper, which maybe it should be, I'm not an expert, but this is the way this came, so it seems fine. If the miter gauge was gonna be a little bit deeper, then I would need the backing plate, but I didn't bother to do that. I don't see how that's gonna cause me any problems because I'm not gonna be, loading this with a whole lot of force, and I've still got at least a third of my plywood there, so that should be just fine. So 2 mistakes. I got much better at routering as a process of making these mistakes, and I think I did a serviceable job repairing it so that it's functional, and that's it. So 3 things. One is assemble your table saw supports after you've assembled the rest of the table so that you can adjust them up and down, and be prepared to cut a few different holes, get set up so you can make that adjustment quickly. Number 2, I would do the pocket screws from the outside and putty over them if you're really concerned about how it looks. You'll get a better mechanical joint. Again, that's only if you're like me and not all that experienced with pocket screws, and you don't want to wind up with messy joints like I did in some places. Number three, be careful when installing your router table that routers feed right to left. Most people know that. I didn't know that. And also, if you're using something other than the specified router plate, then it might be too big and you might run into trouble interfering with the leg. That's it.